Hi everybody, it's Nancy Scott with Masterpiece Quilting. Today on this Watch Me Work series, we're going to talk a little bit about sewing with 2.5-inch pre-cut strips. Lots of times these are called jelly rolls, and Jelly Roll is actually a branded trademark from the Moda company. So when we're talking about these from any company, a bundle of 2.5-inch pre-cut strips tends to be what we refer to. They are 2.5 inches wide by roughly width of fabric, which is going to be about 42 inches long. Every manufacturer has just a little bit difference in length, but as a ballpark, we're going to be at 42 inches. And typically there are about 40 strips in the bundle. And I just love these because they're so pretty. This one I've had for several years, and I've just never unwrapped it because of just how pretty it is. These are produced, obviously rolled and then sliced, cut, in order to get this perfect bundle. Many times in that slicing or cutting process, even though 2.5 inches is the goal, they don't always measure 2.5 inches. So what I like to do when I first get a bundle and I'm unrolling them and pressing them is to take a quick measurement to see exactly how big they are. And I've got a couple different brands here. Doesn't matter which manufacturer. This one you're going to notice has a really wide pinking on it. And that's one of the things that gets a little confusing too when we're sewing. Do we measure and sew from this outer tip? Or do we need to be inside at the inner edge of the cut? Well, the only way to know that for sure is to take a quick measurement. And I'm using a standard cutting grid here and using my grid for measurement so I can just look at it on top of my cutting mat. Lining up, I'm going to start with the outside of the tips, and looking at the outside of the tips on the other side is exactly 2.5 inches. So that tells me if I'm sewing with this strip and I'm lining it up with another strip, I need to have those outer tips, those outer edges, is what I'm lining up either on my 1/4-inch blade or on a tape on my sewing machine. But that's where I'm going to be sewing from. And if you have struggled with this, and if you do struggle with this, don't feel bad because I've struggled with this too. And that's why I'm taping this series for you, because I want you to go through and think about where are you lining up, because if you don't line up in the exact spot, then all your seam allowances are going to be off. And we don't want that. Guilty right here. As I'm speaking, I am guilty. It is very difficult to line up right on those outer tips. I tend to want to shove them over. I want to get those tips out of the way so that I got a little bit more room to sew. Now, here is another strip that I'm going to measure. This one does not have as wide of a pinking strip, so I'm actually going to just use my fingers and kind of feel. There we go. I can just feel the outer edge as I'm lining up. But when I look at this one, it's cut at 2 5/8 inch. So these strips are based off of going from the inside of the pinking to the inside of the pinking. Whoa, that's a whole different ball game. If I want to sew this one and this one together, now I've got to line up one with the outside of their tips and the other one with the inside of the cut tip. And you can actually see with the contrasting color of fabric how they are not the same measurement. Whoa, folks, that's going to throw off some seam allowances really, really fast. And one of the reasons why I know that is because I sewed with these guys and I didn't measure first. And then when I got to squaring up my blocks, I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. These blocks are not the size they need to be. Because when we're talking something being 1/8 of an inch too big, or even 1/16 of an inch too big, 1/16 times 4 is 4/16. I know I'm taking you back to fractions. I'm sorry, but 4/16, that's 1/4 of an inch. So now everything is 1/4 of an inch too big. Oh, wait a minute. That can be problematic when we're sewing. So it all goes back to taking some quick measurements before you get started to see exactly where you're at. With this particular strip that's running 1/8 of an inch too big, I've got some decisions to make. One of them is, do I just go ahead and trim the strip to size? And in hindsight, that's what I wish I would have done, because I'm taking off a fair amount of this strip. Let me just run a little bit down here. I'm pulling off this much. And that's way too much to try to jam into a seam allowance. So going through measuring and then recutting these would have given me the accurate results that I needed. So now, as we're sewing with these, first step is making sure that our strips are cut to the right size. If you're cutting them yourselves, I hope that you're cutting them to the right size. But if I'm cutting 2.5 inch strips, I like to use a 2.5 inch ruler. Gives me that exact width that I need. And I don't have to line up straight on my cutting grid. I can even cut at an angle, just have my fabric straight, but then cut across and know that I'm cutting exactly 2.5 inches because that's what my cutting grid is. So if I've cut strips myself, the second way that we can do a double check to make sure that our strips are the right width and that our seam allowance is the right width, so that when we get everything put together, it's the exact size we want it to be. I have two 2.5 inch strips sewed together, and move the glasses out of the way. I'm going to set that seam first by just quickly pressing over it, and then I'm going to press it to one side. And I'm letting the weight of the iron do the work. But I want to make sure that I'm not skewing that as I'm pressing it, that I'm putting an even amount of weight as I'm pressing the seam open, pressing it on the top to start with, flipping over and doing a quick press on the back. Now that I've got it pressed open, two 2.5 inch pieces sewed together, we're going to end up with 4.5 inches in our width. These are a couple different ways that you can figure that. You can either add everything together and subtract out your seam allowances, or you can work with your finished strip size and then add your seam allowances back on the outer side. So if I want to work with the finished strip width, I have two strips that are going to finish at 2 inches. 2 times 2 is 4. And then I still have the 1/4 inch exposed on both sides, those outer seam allowances. So 4 plus 1/2, 4.5 inches. And using my cutting grid, just laying it on here, laying it on in the correct spot. There we go, 4.5. Lining up, one side is exactly at 4.5. Just a smidgen right there too big. But what's most important is my 2.25 inch line is right on the seam. So if I want to, I can trim at this stage and pull just that little bit off. Depending on how many seams that you're putting together, I don't double check every seam, but I do like to double check every so often. Normally I'll make the first block and then make sure that it's squaring up to size, and then do some troubleshooting if I need to. And as you're sewing, making sure that your 1/4 inch seam allowance, I'm typically using a 1/4 inch foot, making sure that I'm lined up correctly with it. If I need to, I can also put tape on my sewing machine to help me give a guide. And I've reached the stage of the game where if I'm sewing, these guys are going on, because while the camera looks blurry over there anything that is right here, I need this help to make sure that I'm lining up exactly where I'm at. So these are just oversized readers that my eye doctor has prescribed for me because he understands the kind of work that I do. But just some basic readers will give you that magnification up close to make sure that you're getting the accuracy that you need. So this is 3 strips put together. 3 times 2-inch finish would be 6. 1/4 inch on each side takes us to 6.5. Lining up, and I am exactly at 6.5, and my 2 1/4 is exactly where it needs to be. Center strip is only going to be 2 inches because we've already taken seam allowances off of both sides. So that is running straight, and then 2 1/4 on the other side. So that is what we want to get, and we want all of these to be straight. If you start getting wavy or wonky strips, go back and measure those seam allowances on the back side. And I'm just going to refold this real quick by hand here. Measuring that seam allowance on the back side before you even start pressing, super easy. Lay your cutting grid over it, line up your cut edge on one line, and then look over the 1/4 inch, and is your stitching line at that 1/4 inch. So really easy to do a double check. And just being honest, if you're, depending on what time of day I'm sewing, if I'm sewing in the morning, you know what, my seam allowances are pretty much always dead on. If I'm sewing at night, when I'm tired, sometimes they get a little wonky. If I'm sewing and trying to watch TV at the same time, well, you probably know the answer to that. So depending on what that level of concentration is definitely going to affect the width of your seam allowance, or it can. And that's when we just make adjustments, and we use some aids to help us get that accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance. When we start sewing multiple strips together, here I have 6 strips together. I want to be at 12.5 inches. 2-inch finish times 6 would be 12. 1/4 inch on each side takes us to 12.5. And this is a 12.5 inch grid going the opposite direction. So I can use it to confirm my measurements. And let me tug it out a little bit because it was looking a little bit scant. So that's when I need to go back and make sure that I'm pressed properly. Everything is pressed out. There's no little spots that are folded over in that pressing process. And squaring up. This one it's just a smidgen scant. So about 1/16 of an inch scant. So what I'm going to do is go back, repress this, use a pressing spray with it to get it nice, flat, and all stretched out to where we want it to be. So this gives us a little bit of a discussion, kind of starts out talking about getting our 2.5 inch strips for starting here and sewing with them as with the fabric pre-cuts. And then as we're assembling them together, making sure we're using that accurate 1/4 inch seam so that when all of our strips go together, we end up with the exact size block that we want. Because if I'm off a little bit, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seams, 1/16 of an inch off, which is just a couple threads off on a measurement. Now I'm 5/16. I'm a little bit more than 1/4 of an inch off. So accuracy is very important at each step, and you don't have to double check everything. As you become more confident in your sewing abilities and you know that you're consistently getting a good 1/4 inch seam, that your pressing is good and accurate, just do some double checks every once in a while to make sure that you're sewing absolutely perfect, because the last thing we want to have to do is try to fudge in some blocks that just aren't the right size that they want to be. So I hope this has been helpful to you today as we're talking 2.5 inch strips. Again, I'm Nancy Scott with Masterpiece Quilting, and thank you for joining me today as we watch me work. Bye for now.